Hi, my friends. Today I want to present you a new story. Enjoy watching it.
My name is John Smith, and I've spent my entire life in this small Ohio town. You could say I'm a simple man, not one for the big city or fancy things. I work at the local library just a stone's throw away from the town square. It's an old place with creaky wooden floors and the smell of dust and paper that never seems to leave. It's not much, but it's where I belong. The library's where I connect with folks, see familiar faces, and help where I can. My home is modest, a little white house on the edge of town with a front porch that's seen better days. The paint's peeling and the garden's a bit overgrown, but it's mine. I don't need anything more than that. I've never been the type to chase after wealth or fame. What's always mattered to me is making sure the people around me are taken care of. After work, I usually take a walk through town. It's a quiet place with streets lined with maple trees and houses that have stood for generations. I've gotten into the habit of stopping by Mrs. Taylor's place on my way home. She's an elderly widow who's lived alone for years. Her arthritis makes it hard for her to chop wood for the winter. So I've taken it upon myself to make sure she's stocked up. She always insists on baking me cookies as thanks, even though I tell her she doesn't have to. But that's just how folks are around here, grateful even for the little things. "John, you're an angel," Mrs. Taylor said one day as I stacked the last few logs by her front porch. I smiled. "You don't have to say that, Mrs. Taylor. I'm just doing what needs to be done." "But you're always doing it, every year without fail. You make an old woman's life a little easier." Then there's the Johnson family. They fall on hard times ever since the factory shut down. Money's been tight, and they've got 3 young kids to feed. Whenever I can, I bring them groceries, just enough to get by until they can get back on their feet. It's not much, but it's what I can do. One evening, as I handed over a bag of groceries, Sarah Johnson looked at me with tears in her eyes. "John, we don't know how to thank you. We'd be lost without your help." "Sarah," I said, placing a hand on her shoulder, "you don't owe me anything. We're all just trying to get by, and sometimes we need a little help. I'm happy to be here for you, but not everyone in town sees things the way I do. Take Mark Bennett, for instance. He's a businessman through and through, owns most of the stores in town, and has his hands in just about everything. Mark's the type who believes in pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, no matter how tough things get. He's never been one to show much compassion, and he's certainly never approved of the way I help folks out. You're just enabling them, John," Mark said one afternoon as we passed each other on Main Street. His tone was sharp, almost accusatory. "People need to learn to stand on their own 2 feet, not rely on handouts." "I don't see it that way," I replied calmly. "Sometimes people need a hand to stand up. There's no shame in that." Mark just shook his head. "You'll see. One day you'll regret helping so much." I didn't let his words bother me much. I figured as long as I was doing right by others, that was all that mattered. But I was wrong, because Mark Bennett wasn't just annoyed by my kindness. He saw it as a threat, and soon enough he decided to do something about it. It was early on a Tuesday morning when the first signs of trouble appeared. I'd just gotten out of bed when I heard the distant sound of sirens. They weren't outside my house, but they were close enough to make me pause. This was a quiet town. Sirens usually meant something serious had happened. A few hours later, just as I was getting ready to head to the library, there was a knock at my door. When I opened it, 2 police officers were standing on my porch, looking far more serious than I'd ever seen them before. "Mr. Smith," one of them said, his voice calm but firm, "we need to talk. There's been a robbery at one of Mark Bennett's stores, and we have reason to believe you were involved." I stared at them, confused. "Involved? What are you talking about? I've never stolen a thing in my life." The officer exchanged a look with his partner. "We're just following up on the evidence," he said, and before I knew it, they were taking me down to the station for questioning. At the station, I sat across from Detective Harlan, a tall, no-nonsense man who didn't waste time with pleasantries. "John, I'm gonna be straight with you," he began, leaning across the table. "Mark Bennett's accusing you of being involved in a robbery at his hardware store. Claims you've been using your good guy image to cover up some shady dealings." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "That's absurd," I said, shaking my head. "I've never even been inside his store after hours, let alone stolen anything." "He's got witnesses," Harlan said, folding his arms across his chest. "People who claim they saw you near the store the night it happened. What do you say to that?" "I say they're mistaken," I replied, my voice steady despite the knot in my stomach. I was home that night, same as always. But despite my protests, the accusations stuck. Word spread fast in our small town, and before long, people were talking. The whispers started almost immediately, people questioning if they ever really knew me at all. Sitting in that cold, sterile interrogation room, I felt a mix of anger and helplessness. How could someone like Mark Bennett, a man who had everything, go out of his way to ruin my life? And for what? Because he didn't like the way I lived? Because he thought I was making him look bad? The weight of the accusation pressed down on me. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure if I could find a way out. Jail is a lonely place, even in a small town like ours. I'd never been in trouble with the law before, never even had a run-in with the police. But there I was, sitting in a cell, staring at the concrete walls, wondering how everything had gone so wrong. The hours dragged by, each one heavier than the last. I always believed that if you lived a good life, did right by others, then good things would come your way. But now I wasn't so sure. One afternoon I got a visitor. It was Mrs. Taylor. She walked into the visiting room, her eyes filled with concern, but there was a quiet determination in her voice. "John," she said as she sat down across from me, "we're not going to let this happen. You've done too much good in this town for us to just sit by and let Mark Bennett ruin your life." I smiled, though it felt forced. "I appreciate that, Mrs. Taylor, but I'm not sure what anyone can do. He's got evidence, witnesses. People lie, John," she said firmly, "and we're going to prove it." Outside the jail, the town was buzzing with talk. People were choosing sides, and it seemed like the whole place was divided right down the middle. Some folks stood by me, saying there was no way I could have done what I was accused of. They knew me, they'd seen me in action, and they refused to believe the lies. But others weren't so sure. Mark Bennett had a lot of influence in this town, and his word carried weight. Doubt started creeping in, and soon even some of my closest friends were questioning if they really knew me at all. One of those friends, Mike Henderson, came to visit me a few days later. He was a big guy with a heart just as large, but today, he looked uncertain, almost conflicted. "John," he began, rubbing the back of his neck, "I've known you for years. You've always been a stand-up guy, but I gotta ask, is there any truth to what they're saying?" I looked him in the eyes, hoping he could see the honesty in mine. "Mike, I swear to you, I didn't do it. I've never stolen anything in my life." He nodded slowly. "I believe you, John. But people are talking, and Mark, he's got people convinced." "I know," I said quietly, "but we'll get through this, somehow." I tried to hold on to hope, tried to believe that the truth would come out and that everything would be okay in the end. But as the days turned into weeks, that hope started to fade. It felt like the whole world was against me, and I had no way to prove my innocence. But then, just when I thought all was lost, a glimmer of hope appeared. A few folks I'd helped over the years, people like Mrs. Taylor and the Johnson family, decided they weren't going to let Mark Bennett win without a fight. It was Sarah Johnson who first came to me with the news. She arrived at the jail with a look of determination in her eyes, a look I hadn't seen in anyone since this whole mess began. "John," she said breathlessly, "we found something." I sat up, hope flaring in my chest. "What is it?" "Mark Bennett's been paying off witnesses," she explained, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and excitement. "We found someone, one of the people who claimed they saw you at the store. Turns out Mark offered them money to lie, and they're willing to come forward." For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. "Sarah, are you sure? This could be what we need to clear my name." She nodded, her hands clenched into fists. "We're sure. We've already told the police. They're reopening the investigation." It didn't take long for the news to spread. The town, which had been divided for so long, suddenly found itself united in shock and outrage. Mark Bennett, the man who had always prided himself on being a pillar of the community, was exposed as a fraud. The truth came out in bits and pieces, but by the end of it, there was no doubt. He'd orchestrated the whole thing, set me up to take the fall for a crime I didn't commit, all because he couldn't stand the way people respected me. When I finally stood before the judge, it wasn't to hear my sentence, but to hear my name cleared. The charges were dropped and I was free to go. The relief was overwhelming, but it was mixed with a deep sense of sadness. My life would never be the same again. The damage had been done, and even though the truth was out, there were still scars left behind. After the hearing, I ran into Detective Harlan outside the courthouse. He looked at me with a mixture of regret and respect. "John," he said, extending his hand, "I'm sorry for what you went through. We should have seen through Mark's lies sooner." I shook his hand, though my heart wasn't fully in it. "It's over now. That's what matters." But even as I said the words, I knew it wasn't really over. Mark Bennett might have been exposed, but the damage he'd done to this town, to my reputation, couldn't be undone overnight. It would take time, and I wasn't sure if things would ever truly go back to the way they were. Still, I couldn't let that stop me. I'd spent my whole life helping others, and I wasn't about to let one man's lies change that. If anything, it only strengthened my resolve. I'd come out of this ordeal stronger and more determined than ever to do good in the world, no matter how hard it got. After everything that had happened, you might think I'd be bitter, angry at the world, and especially at Mark Bennett. He'd nearly destroyed my life, taken away my freedom, and shattered the trust I'd spent years building in this town. And yet, as strange as it sounds, I couldn't bring myself to hate him. There was a financial crisis, and I'd heard through the grapevine that Mark had lost everything: his businesses, his reputation, his standing in the community. He was on the brink of bankruptcy with nowhere to turn. And for the first time, he was the one in need of help. One evening, after a long day at the library, I decided to pay him a visit. His office, which had once been the center of his little empire, was now a sad, empty place. The walls were bare, the furniture sparse. When I walked in, I found him sitting at his desk, staring at a stack of unpaid bills. He looked up when he saw me, and for a moment, I saw a flash of the old Mark, the confident, powerful businessman who thought he could control everything and everyone around him. But that look quickly faded, replaced by something I'd never seen in him before: humility. "John," he said quietly, his voice thick with regret, "I don't deserve your forgiveness." "You're right," I replied, stepping closer to his desk, "but everyone deserves a second chance." He stared at me, disbelief written all over his face. For a long moment, neither of us said anything. Then slowly he reached out and shook my hand. It wasn't much, but it was a start. From that day on, things were different. Mark wasn't the same man he'd been before. He started helping out around town, volunteering at the food bank, fixing up the park, and lending a hand to folks who needed it. It wasn't easy for him. He had a lot of bridges to rebuild, a lot of trust to earn back, but he was trying. And for the first time, I saw that maybe, just maybe, people can change. As for me, life slowly returned to normal. The whispers died down, and folks started to see me for who I really was again. It took time, but I found peace in the simple things: the quiet walks through town, the familiar faces at the library, and the knowledge that no matter how dark things got, there was always light at the end of the tunnel. One day, as we were both working at the community center, Mark approached me. He looked unsure, like a man still trying to find his footing. "John," he began, "I've been thinking. Maybe we could do more together. You know, help people in town. With your kindness and, well, my experience in business, maybe we could make a real difference." I considered his words carefully. The idea of working side by side with the man who had tried to destroy me seemed almost surreal. But then again, if there was a chance to turn something bad into something good, wasn't that worth pursuing? "Let's give it a shot, Mark," I said, extending my hand once more. "Let's see what we can do." And so we did. Together, we started small projects around town, helping where we could, making life just a little bit easier for those who needed it. It wasn't always easy, and there were still days when the past felt too close for comfort. But with time, trust started to rebuild, both between us and in the town itself. Looking back, I realized that kindness isn't always about what you give. Sometimes it's about what you forgive. And in that forgiveness, I found my own peace.